Hello and welcome to episode 70 of the Alfa Romeo Driver Podcast, brought to you by the Alfa Romeo Owners Club. I'm Guy Swarbrick, and this week I have the privilege of sitting down with racing driver and AutoItalia road and track test driver, Roberto Gordanelli. Good afternoon, Roberto.
Pleased to be here.
Yeah, one of the reasons we're having the conversation is your new book, which we'll talk about later on. But I just wanted to go back to the start, because lots of people will have seen your name in magazines like AutoItalia, but possibly don't know that much about you and your background. So if we go right back to the beginning, you were born in an area that was featured in the latest Stanley Tucci In Search of Italy series as a region of Italy. But it's a region that some of our listeners will probably be more familiar with than others, isn't it?
Actually, I was born in Kensington to Italian parents and then whisked off to southern Italy on regular visits. Spent a lot of time in Calabria, which is the toe of the Italian boot and notorious for problems. It's been invaded by lots of different cultures. They invade and then they go, oh my God, and they run away because it's ungovernable.
Yeah, and you would think, given the location, that it would be a kind of rich and fertile area, but I think it's quite a hostile place to live as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's mountainous. It's a very poor area. There's not a lot of business going on down there. Any business that does happen is always under threat of mafia, protection money it has to pay. And it's still the same today. The government pours money down there, but nothing much comes back out.
Yeah. So your early life was going backwards and forwards between London and Italy, but educated here, I think.
Yes, educated in West London in a private school, which was very tough. The treatment was harsh, lots of corporal punishment, stuff that you couldn't do today, but it was normal in certain schools back then, not all schools even. Yeah, it taught me how to write, how to speak, I suppose, but not much else, I don't think.
And then, I guess not the typical career for a public school boy. You started with an airline, I believe.
Yeah, I didn't know what to do when my school report said that I would have done well had I attended, but I had long periods in Italy, and that limited my studies. I got to 5 GCSEs, GCEs they were called then, quite tough. And I was already hooked, fascinated on motorised transport. And I was taken to a careers advisor who asked me what I did at the weekends. And I said, I try and make my Lambretta go faster. What, with your own hands, you do it yourself? Yes, right, off you go, engineering. So I was put into an engineering company with 1.5 days per week at Twickenham Technical College. And that's it. I did a 5-year engineering apprenticeship. From that, I needed to buy a house and I didn't have enough money. So British Airways offered me about, I don't know, a few pounds a week more. It wasn't very much more, but it was enough to buy a house. And so I went to British Airways and it was the amalgamation period of BOAC and BEA. And was there for a year. It was a job for life, and I didn't like it. I didn't want to be at British Airways for the rest of my life. I wanted to be messing around with racing cars, and so I left just to do that.
So out of the airline and into the motor trade, if you like, what were the early jobs in motor engineering? Okay,
I had already, during my 5-year apprenticeship, I already built my own competition car, and I raced that at Wimbledon Stadium and did very well. And it was a production car sprint, and it was the finals, and I came second by narrowest of margins. But that got me hooked. I went to Brands Hatch, to the motor racing stables there. And then when after my engineering studies were finished, 5 years were up, and British Airways, 1 year, I left to help my mother's company. My father had a job in the city in London. But my mother was part of a business, Rossi Cafe restaurant, Rossi ice cream business, a Rossi workshop garage, and they were struggling financially. And I went there and revolutionized every department and turned it into profit. But my main attraction was the workshop because it was somewhere I could mess around with cars and in there, with a friend, we built a special saloon, Lotus Anglia, and but then that business had to close down because of town centre redevelopment with no compensation. We were out, and I was out, and everybody was unemployed, and I had to start again.
So where did you go then?
I worked from home, fixing cars, and built. I raced. I had an E-Type Jaguar then, raced that, built a completely mad turbocharged car, E-Type wide-bodied thing. Nobody knew what a turbo was. I bought a book from the USA on how to turbocharge your aeroplane because that's the only book I could find. Built this thing and then tested it at Brands Hatch, and Autosport magazine found out about it and wrote a thing. And then the Motorsport Association immediately banned it because they feared an arms race. They didn't want anyway. So that was the end of that.
And they were kind of right as well, weren't they?
They were. They were absolutely right. But I was on my own. I was nobody to guide me. I was just doing what felt right. And there you go. And then I met Peter Crutch, furniture designer, mad on Alfa Romeo, had a huge collection of Alfa Romeo rare cars, not interested in driving them or being in them. He just liked to own them. And he spotted me at Brands Hatch when I was racing my Alfa. I had an Alfa Romeo Sprint GT. And he came over, and it was the only Alfa that could challenge the Lotus Cortinas. And he came over and said, very modest man. I didn't think he was anybody special at the time. And he said, would you like to, can we go racing? Can we build a car and let's do something? Alfa Romeo. I said, yeah, absolutely. So Peter financed my racing, and I ran in the Alfa Romeo Championship. I won the class 2 years running, the large engine modified championship twice in the mid 80s. And that was the sort of launch of I suppose you're semi-pro then, aren't you? Because somebody's paying you to do stuff and to race. And from then on, I've managed to not scrape a living from motor racing, but I've earned little bits, or if I've owned a car, I've sold it for more money than I spent on it. Just about. I never kept any accounts. That wasn't my real business, and that led me into race instructing. And once you're a race instructor, you meet all sorts of people, with collectors, people with cars, and if they like you, you end up sharing their car on long distance events and being paid to do that. And I've just done 10 years with a lovely chap. He came from nothing. Track day, racing, 10 racing cars, now British GT, and he's okay now. He's flying solo. He doesn't need me anymore. So I'm just doing little bits of instructing and running my own car. I always wanted my own car, just in case, because nothing is forever.
Yeah. So that's the racing side of things. I guess, like a lot of our members, I grew up reading car magazines long before I had a driving license, and the one thing that many of us would always have wanted to be was a test driver and a car tester for magazines. So how did you get into that side of the business?
I had quite a reasonable profile with Italian cars, and I knew Phil Ward, who was doing the Italian Car Day. This was way before AutoItalia magazine, and I submitted stuff to other magazines, and then Phil asked me to supply a car for a magazine called Italian Cars, another title that went bust. It wasn't his magazine, and I supplied a car, and he said, "Can you write something?" And I did, and he liked it, and then got more work in that, and with Ferrari World magazine and World Sports Cars, and then they all went bust. Lots of magazines went bust. And then Phil Ward decided to launch AutoItalia magazine. He asked me if I'd like to sort of contribute financially. I said, no, I've got too much going on. I can't do that. So I became a contributor, freelance. And and then in the first few magazines, I was virtually writing the whole magazine, driving all the cars. But we weren't that well known, so it was quite hard to get your foot in the door with the big manufacturers. But we did. I did 20 years of that, and I still supply the odd story to AutoItalia, which is fine. It doesn't pay that well, but that's not the reason I do it.
And I think a lot of people kind of assume that when you write those kind of reports, you've got a week with the car or whatever, but often it's not like that, is it? It's a couple of hours or even less at times. So how do you go about making sure that you you know what story to tell about the car?
I'm quite quick at seeing what a car is and summarising it. I suppose motor racing helps there, because when you're racing, you're on it first lap. As soon as the flag goes down or the lights go out or whatever type of start you've got, you're flat out straight away, and you just learn very quickly what's going on with a car. And I can do that with a road car. And so, and Phil, AutoItalia, they worked out that I could do this. So the cars on long-term loan, usually a week, never came my way. I had them for just a short time while the people higher up the food chain hung on to the cars. But I didn't mind that. I don't mind. I don't have to drive around in a new car. I'm quite happy with old cars on the road. They're less worry. And that's that.
So in terms of the process, your engineering background and your motor racing experience tells you what to look for and gives you a feel for the car. Do you record thoughts during the test, or do you kind of thrash it around for 20 minutes or so and then make some notes afterwards, or is it just all stored up in your head?
No, I say, but I don't store stuff much in my head. I say my brain is a factory, not a warehouse, so I can't remember anything. But how I do it is as far as I have a camera, so I take lots of pictures. That way I can see things, that I can remember stuff like that. I've got a spec sheet. And I also used to have, don't have it anymore, I have a palm top. Now I use a telephone, which is not as good as a palm top. Palm top's a mini laptop. And you can, and I just make notes with that during the test. Now, a road test and a track test, yes, that involves driving, and it's hard to write and drive at the same time. But it also involves photography. So a professional photographer will want to take shots of the car, stationary and all the rest of it. And there's a lot of hanging about. It's a bit like the film business. There's a lot of hanging about. And during that hanging about, I can make notes there live straight away with the car. That way I record everything. I don't have to remember anything. It's all there on my palm top. And that enabled me to test several cars in the same day, because economies of scale when you're at a test track. Magazines haven't got a lot of money, and that's important.
Yeah. And is there a kind of checklist of things that you'll run through to make sure you cover off all aspects of the car and its dynamics, or is it just kind of dependent on where you are for the test and the time you've got?
Yeah, things leap out at you quite soon on the car, and they're the things you notice first of all. And then then when you've got time, you think, well, on all the things: braking, accelerating, cornering, handling, comfort, noise, practicality, all that comes later, really. The press packs help a little bit that the manufacturer gives you, because that has lots of technical information. And from that technical information, you can see and reinforce your own views that you've had when you were with the car.
And has that got more complicated over time as you've had things like the ability to control setup from software in the car? So there isn't one car. There's however you happen to set the car up at the time, whether it's a simple DNA switch on an Alfa, or suspension and throttle response controls and stuff like that.
Well, the road cars, there's nothing to adjust. Not in the cars that I've tested. The car is the car, but the racing testing is completely different. When you're testing a car for a magazine, it's how it drives and stuff like that. And you just have to write informative stuff put a few jokes or quotes or something funny to keep people awake. But racing testing is completely different. Racing testing is when you drive a racing car, it's no good coming in and say, well, it understeers, because it's the setup. You can make adjustments to change that. So with racing setup, you're constantly going in and out of the pits, making adjustments, looking at data. It's all squiggly lines on laptops now. It's not seat of the pants stuff anymore. Well, it's both. Very different kinds of testing, racing and testing cars for magazine. One is continuous adjustment and testing, and the other isn't.
Yeah. And you've tested dozens, if not hundreds of cars, including, I think, 6 F1 cars. Yeah. If you had to, what would be your favourite 2 or 3 cars from that time?
Well, favourite racing cars, I quite liked the Le Mans Ferrari from 1970. I drove the 512M. It was a blue Sunoco car that was re-engineered in the USA. And that was a pretty amazing car. Racing cars, come with and without downforce. And I prefer the cars that don't have downforce. So it's more seat of the pants. Downforce cars, you've got to trust in the downforce. You've got to go into a high-speed corner at a crazy speed and just hope that it all sticks to the road. My favourite, magic wand, if I could have my next race car, which I haven't got the money to buy anyway, but would be an Alfa Romeo GTAM from 1970. That is something. I built a mad version that wasn't FIA compliant, and I wanted to be in historic, so that went away. But an Alfa GTAM, I'd like one of those. That's seat of the pants, simple, analog, no electronics, run it yourself kind of car. Running cars yourself now is getting quite rare. I call them men in sheds. You go to a race meeting, there are a few men in sheds, not very many. Depends what sort of race meeting you're at. I like the race meetings where there are more men in sheds. I've done lots of race meetings without, though, where it's all pro teams, big trucks. And if you're running a car yourself, then it's quite hard and expensive now.
And road cars? Favourite road cars from the...
Road cars, I don't drive quickly on the road anymore. I used to once upon a time. I used to be a menace, but I don't now. I'm quite law-abiding now, and I like to be comfortable and up in the air. So SUVs. I mean, we've got a couple of Range Rovers in, one for me, one for my wife. But tomorrow I am going back to the Alfa Romeo world and buying a 147. Because I had to sell my old 147 because it's not ULEZ compliant for the London zone coming out to right next to my house. I'm just outside, but it limits my thing. So, and the Alfa Romeo itch won't go away. So I'm buying a petrol late model 147 tomorrow.
I was going to mention that because you contacted me a couple of days ago to see if I knew anybody who had one. So what did you end up with in the end?
It's a Collezione, the last one they made, and it's a low mileage car, very low mileage, 30,000 miles. Picking it up tomorrow. Looking forward to getting it on the road. And
I guess given that it is an Alfa Romeo podcast, we should probably ask, what other notable Alfas have you owned as road cars?
Well, my first time on a track was with a 101 series Giulia Alfa at Brands Hatch in the 60s. And was about 60, 68, something like that. 67 with an Alfa. And I was at a track day at Brands Hatch, going around this absolutely standard Giulia 1600, the sort of roundy shape one, pre-Bertone coupe shape, pre-105, 101 series. And it was my first crash on a race circuit. I haven't had many crashes, 3 or 4. My first crash, and I was going down the main straight at Brands Hatch, and some single-seaters came flying past me, coming into Paddock Hill Bend. I thought, right, I'll show them. So I hung on to them going into Paddock Hill Bend and worked out that a bog standard Alfa Romeo 101 series can't go around Paddock Hill Bend as fast as a single-seater racing car. And crashed it, not very badly, but it was an easy fix, just the rear corner, the rear lamp, really. Lucky. But that taught me a lesson. And that was my first time on track with an Alfa Romeo. Raced the Sprint GT, raced the Zagato body car, which I won the championship with, raced the GTV6, raced, this is racing, not test driving. Test driving, I've driven everything. So racing, Alfas. Well, my mad turbocharged car, 500 horsepower car, that was just amazing. And I regret selling that. But it was a period in my life when I was desperate for money. We bought a house in Italy and we'd overspent, and I needed to sell everything I had to pay the bills. And that had to go, unfortunately.
Again, that's the race car side of things. Any Alfa Romeo road cars, other than the 147, obviously, that you would, money no object, that you'd have in the garage?
I've been the European correspondent for a magazine in Dubai called Wheels for 20 years. And they sent me to Balocco, the Alfa Romeo test track in Italy, a year ago, 2 years ago. Anyway, I drove the entire range of Alfa Romeos. I drove the Giulia, the Fast One, and the Stelvio. And I'd have the Stelvio because I like SUVs for road use. If I didn't have motor racing, maybe I'd go for a saloon car, a Giulia or something, but I get my speed thing on racetracks, instructing or testing or racing. So I want to be up in the air and comfort with good vision. And the Stelvio is an amazing thing. It handles like a sports car and it's got all the advantages of an SUV.
Yeah, I the first time I drove a Stelvio Quadrifoglio was at Goodwood on the circuit, And I mean, you'll know Goodwood far better than I do, but I came out of the chicane and got the right rear wheel on the chocolate blocks on the exit from the chicane and felt the back end starting to go. And I know if I was in a Giulia, I'd have been pirouetting down the main straight for about 10 minutes before it stopped. And the Stelvio just put the power to the front wheels, pulled me out of it, made me look much more competent than I was. And I think, given the choice between a Giulia and a Stelvio Quadrifoglio, despite how good the Giulia is, I'd have the Stelvio too. It's just a phenomenal car.
Yeah, it probably saved you, because doing what you did at Goodwood, putting a wheel on the exit of the chicane, quite often will cause you to turn left and go into the barrier.
Yeah. You might argue that it was the weight of the Stelvio that put me there in the first place, but at least it got me out of it.
I know exactly what you mean by that, because when I was at Bolocco with the Stelvio, I was getting carried away. And then I was going, Bolocco has fast corners, which it was great at, but it also has one really, really slow corner. And I'd forgotten that I was driving a 2-ton car or whatever it was, and the laws of physics took over, and it wouldn't change direction like a fly or stop like a fly. While it's brilliant, and I don't think there's anything else better in that sector, you do have to remember that you've got 4 little rubber contact patches, and I don't know what they weigh, 2 tons or something, hurtling along. It's not a caterer.
No, but it is. Yeah, I often say to people, it was about 3 laps into my Goodwood stint before I suddenly realised or remembered that it wasn't a hot hatch that I was driving. It was in fact an SUV, and it's that good that it fools you. But there's a limit. It's
something that you're not going to have trouble with on the road. It's only when you do silly things like taking a road car on a racetrack that you're going to find those sort of problems.
Yeah. So we've talked about the book. Let's go back to the book. The book came out, a month or so ago?
Yeah, 2 or 3 weeks ago.
So I guess the first question is, given that we'll talk about the content, and I thoroughly recommend the book, is there still time to get a copy for Christmas? Because it's this will go out on Sunday the 18th. It's going to be a bit tight, but if people put an order in on Monday, will they still get one?
Yes. How it works is I'm controlling this. So the order comes into me in my office here, my laptop. The books are here. I pack them. I dispatch them straight away with a courier on their next day service. I don't know whether the next day service is the next day, but it's certainly less than 2 days, or 2 days max, I think, for UK. So yes, 18th, it should be okay. For Christmas, and then you've got something to read over the solstice, a real dark part of the year,
and plenty to read. It's a good hefty book, and it's quite an interesting structure, isn't it? Because it's chronological, but it's not a memoir in a traditional sense. It's a series of stories.
It's kind of in almost a diary form, but I go off subject all the time to keep people awake. It's not technical. It's not a rehash of old magazine tests. I don't know whether when I was asked to do it, whether that's what they wanted or not. It's just me writing what I wanted to write. And I think it works. I've had good reports from people that have read it, so who knows?
Yeah, we got it just after the deadline for the December issue, so our review will be in the February issue. But for those people who can't wait for the review, just order a copy anyway. It's well worth it. Without giving too much away about what's in it, it's a fascinating read.
Thank you.
Just looking at the list of cars you've driven on your website, it's close to 500 altogether. Almost 400 Italian cars and over 100 Alfas. The only thing that comes close is Ferrari, which is a dozen or so behind Alfa Romeo. And we know you've just bought another one. So what keeps you coming back to Alfas?
There's something about the marque, the Alfa Romeo, and the people in the club. I've met lots of different people in lots of different clubs, and the Alfa people are nice, and the Maserati people are nice. And those 2 clubs have the nicest people in them of all the clubs that I know. But there's something about driving. If an Alfa pulls up in my driveway and I don't know the person, I don't know, it's a strange car and it arrives, you just know that whoever's driving that car, there's something about them, something good about them, something, they've got taste. They don't run with the herd, and the brand has that. The Alfa Romeo brand sits between the everyday ordinary cars that are sold. Mr. Kia didn't make cars to go racing. He made cars to make money. Alfa Romeo similar to, they made them for motorsport. Alfa Romeo sits somewhere between the sort of everyday mass market cars and the premium brands, the Ferraris and the Aston Martins and Porsche. And it sits there in a very tasteful way, in a very understated, tasteful way. And I like to think I'll always have an Alfa Romeo on the fleet.
And it's a remarkably flexible brand as well, I guess. The fact that you can sell an 8C Competizione for the price they sold them. Yeah, and at the time they were selling the 8C, you could buy a Mito, or shortly afterwards, you could buy a Mito for a tenth of the price. I don't think there are many brands that have got that kind of range of credibility.
That's right. Yeah, the flagship models help. I don't know how they can afford to do that. Lots of manufacturers won't go there, but Alfa can because of its heritage. Its heritage is what does it, and that's not an easy thing to get.
And I guess the other question then, given where we are at the moment, is what's your thinking in terms of how that heritage goes forward, I guess, under Stellantis ownership? So, as far as we can tell, Stellantis is controlled by ex-Peugeot and Citroën people. So how does Alfa survive and go forward in that set of circumstances, and the challenge of keeping the spirit of Alfa as we move to electric propulsion?
Well, whoever owns Alfa Romeo would be foolish to ignore the heritage, because that's the reason that people buy them. One of the reasons. Electric cars, EVs. Funny thing, you have to, I don't know how that's going to work, really. The first wave are eco people who are keen and they buy the cars and they're going to get them straight away. The next wave that's happening now are the people who have their own companies and get massive tax advantages by buying them. And the third wave, I get, is going to be the mass market. And I don't know, I meet too many people that say it's too early, or, where are we going to plug it in? How are we going to charge it? What happens when it's a few years old and the batteries are going to be useless? Because, your telephone battery tells you how long the batteries are going to before they're scrapped. So I don't know. I can't see into the future on this. We keep being told that it's going to happen. It's the future. You can't stop it. But I can't see the nuts and bolts of it, how it's going to work.
No, and I guess there's all of the practical stuff. There's, range and the ability to plug it in and all of that kind of stuff. I guess the other bit that fascinates me is one of the things that's always differentiated Alfa, even at the lowest points, if you like, when they were forced to part share with GM, is the engines. The engines have always had something about them that's been different to everything else in the market. And that's going to be much harder to do when it's, 2 or 4 electric motors and a big battery pack.
Yeah, I've tested 4 electric cars, and I don't know how you're going to make them special. You can make them really ridiculously fast, but that's quite dangerous, letting really fast because they're heavy and 2-ton thing hurtling along. Plus, we might be in for some speed restriction that automatic eventually on your cars. I don't know. I suppose they've got to make them lighter, make them handle better, make them, the styling has got to be better. And all the things that they used to do with internal combustion engine cars, they've got to find a way of doing that with EVs, and I guess they will.
Yeah, I mean, I drove a 595 SA and a 500E back to back on the hill route at Millbrook 2 years ago, and I was quite surprised how much fun the 500E was. I guess it'll be interesting now that they're around to see how much the Abarth version of the 500 moves that on. But as you say, it's very early days of the kind of mass market fun cars like Alfa with those kind of drivetrains. It's either been the big Tesla saloons or real eco things like the Citroën Ami and stuff. That middle ground really hasn't been explored very much yet.
Yeah, I suppose the styling is the thing, isn't it? Because the electric motor is an electric motor, and it's just how powerful you want to make it, and feed it and range. But the styling, I think, and the interiors, and they'll work on stuff like that just to make them stand out, make them be different.
Yep. And we hear rumours of a super hybrid Alfa in the next 6 months or so with the V6 from the Quadrifoglio and an electric rear end, or a front end, I guess, because it's mid-engine, isn't it, according to the rumour. Is that something you think needs to continue longer? It's kind of easing us into electric with some more fun hybrids?
I guess so. I think the high, it's 2030, is it? They're saying no more pure internal combustion after 2030. So hybrids will carry on. How much longer? I don't know. Another 5 years or something on top of that. Plus, you wonder whether those dates are pulled out of the hat, and they have the ability to change those dates if it doesn't work. So I guess the hybrid is, as you say, the hybrid is the next stage. And of course, hydrogen. You've got two kinds of hydrogen car, haven't you? You've got the type where hydrogen makes electricity and the type where you can actually run an internal combustion engine on hydrogen. Yeah. So by the time we get into the dates they're talking about, 2030, 2035, who knows? It's predicting the future in mind.
Yeah. Well, and I guess the other big unknown is what it does to motorsport, because even if we're able to carry on driving or racing internal combustion engines, the pool of cars to do that from and the manufacturer involvement in producing new race cars that then get moved down the food chain is going to be an interesting period for motorsport.
Yeah, but they've already run Formula One cars with the existing engines, burning zero carbon fuels, hydrogen, special synthetic fuels.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the way to go for some racing. I don't know. For historics, of course, historics will carry on just like, steam trains carry on.
For things where Alfa's been historically heavily involved, like touring car racing, when all the touring cars are electric only, it's going to be difficult to sustain. I mean, the ETCR has been interesting, and I use that word quite wrongly.
Well, touring car racing gets its audience on the screen. People watch it on the screen TV, so they don't know what's powering it. It doesn't make any difference as long as they're bashing door handles and looks exciting. Then it'll carry on.
Yeah, maybe. We've talked about the journey to get here. What's the journey going forward look like? What's on the plans for next year and beyond?
Well, I've got my own race car. I'll be running that. I've got my own fleet of cars to fettle and look after. I do a bit of property maintenance. We've got a place in Italy and a place in Scotland, and this place in Sunbury-on-Thames, and there's loads of work to do there. I'm doing little bits of writing for AutoItalia. I've got little bits of race instruction. I've got more than I need. As for when I stop racing, I'm 75 years old in a minute. So, I always say you're only as old as your lap time. So
the lap times are still holding up.
Yeah, they're still holding up. So I'll just keep doing it. It keeps me fit. So I shall carry on.
Mentally and physically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'll just carry on doing what I'm doing until I fall over, I guess.
Brilliant. Thank you, Roberto. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Guy. Yeah, my pleasure too. Thanks.
Well, that's all we have time for this week, except to say that Roberto's book is available to buy from roberto-giordanelli.com/book for £45. 240 pages and almost 600 images from throughout his career. It's a fabulous gift for any petrolhead, and particularly anyone with an interest in Italian cars. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time on New Year's Day, when we'll be talking to Alan Thomas, the club's modified cars registrar. Episode 71 will be available to download from 1:30 p.m. on January the 1st from Podbean, Podcast Addict, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere else good podcasts are found. Until then, stay safe.